Hello and welcome to week 6 in the history of psychology, and what a dynamic area in the history of psychology we are entering into right now. Looking at chapter 6, functionalism. Now, we have to really kind of tear apart the idea of functionalism at this time, and there's probably no way in which we can overemphasize the effect of Darwin during this period of history, who has had probably, I mean, probably the most influential scientist of all time. Darwin came along, introduced his idea of natural selection, that changes in the environment selected particular traits to be advantageous for individual species to pass on those traits to the next generation, increase their survival. This idea totally galvanized the field of psychology and every other science that was going on. We're introduced in the attention section of this chapter to a sociologist who will be in the next chapter, actually. Probably should go over there. But anyway, Herbert Spencer comes along, and Herbert Spencer is actually the person who coined the term the survival of the fittest. That was not Darwin that did that. Nowhere in his Origin of Species does that term exist. Certainly became vernacular after that, very common language. And we hear about it all the time. The interesting thing was Spencer was not referring to, let's say, furry mammals being able to are more fit to survive within an increasingly cold environment, therefore they survived. He wasn't talking about that at all. He was talking about societies, human societies, that the societies that lasted, if you look at the history of society and civilizations have come and gone. Herbert Spencer's notion of survival of the fittest addressed that if there was a society that couldn't weather the changes that were going on, whether they're economic or environmental or political or whatever, then it went away. It wasn't fit. The society wasn't fit to adapt to changing circumstances on a global scale. He was an incredibly popular individual among the barons of industry that were going on in America at that time. So he was an individual that said the American experiment, with all of its democracies and with its emphasis on productivity and investment and industry and all these natural resources, was most ideally positioned to be the most fit of all the countries in history. We can see where that rather egocentric perspective of America being the greatest nation on earth in history comes from. And it comes from this notion that the United States is the most fit, the most able to adjust to changing global circumstances. Now let's pull that back a little bit into psychology, because that exists out there, this whole notion, and we see how specifically did Darwin's thoughts impact psychology in the study of human and animal behavior. Now, the first impact was because Darwin supposed that genetically we were related to all of the other species that exist within the world, then it became logical that if we studied animals and came to conclusions about how they thought, how they acted, how their nervous system worked, we could then draw parallels to the human being. Darwin's work introduced animal and comparative psychology. Let's study animals and see what we can learn, not only about the animals, but what can we learn in terms of human behavior, because we're just a more advanced version of that particular animal. The next is looking at function. Now we see, and I'm going to say versus structure. In structuralism and all that, we're looking at both the specific physiological structure, but then also what we just talked about in structuralism, the actual components that make up thought and experience. Darwin was more interested in how did that particular function come about And because it was selected for survival, Y is an advantage. Why is that particular behavior a functional advantage? Jealousy. Why is that a functional advantage? Take a very complex idea of human notion and experience, and we ask the question, what function does it survive that it was selected to keep repeating in our genetic history? Good question. He also introduced diverse methodology, moving or not moving away from anything, but it's starting to include things like chemistry and biology and even oceanography and weather and climate and agriculture and all of these things that have an impact on the human experience. And finally, after all of that, we see this notion under Darwin as the emergence of a psychology of individual differences. I'm going to go back to Spencer. The sociologists and political scientists of the day were looking at what makes America different? What makes it different from the UK? What makes it different from Saudi Arabia? Whatever, such that, as they believed, it's the greatest country on earth, the most adept to survive global changes. So individual countries looking at how they're different, that trickled down to a fascination with individual differences in human being that gave them, although not in terms of an evolutionary perspective, which really focuses on our capacity to pass on our traits to the next generation, but individual differences that made that individual more likely to thrive. And we get the birth of testing. Let's look at things like IQ. Let's look at something cognitive speed. Let's look at these things that we feel will give individuals a leg up in terms of their ability to thrive and adapt. Now, Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, considered one of the most brilliant people in history. Really, he was a polymath. He was across the board in various sciences and whatever, produced incredible works. But sadly, or maybe importantly, he is recognized as the creator, or not necessarily the creator, but certainly publicized the idea of eugenics. Now, eugenics is the notion that now that we are thinking beings, we're not totally on the whim of our basic needs, maybe we should be planning out who should have kids and who shouldn't have kids so that we can create a better society made up of individuals with superior traits. Now, his book on eugenics, which from a scientific brain experiments has some sort of logic. In fact, when we are shopping for our partners, when we are dating, we are considering partners that have traits that we like, that are not only advantageous to us, but they have traits that would be passed on to our children. There's a certain amount of eugenic quality to that. I'm going to pick a good partner. Whatever you define as a good partner, probably good traits that they have. You probably avoid negative traits. Now, that done on an individual dating level is very different than we start introducing social policy. But Hitler felt that that was just fine. On Hitler's favorite books of the day shelf was Francis Galton's book. That idea that there are superior races exemplified by technological advantages. When you look at the northern hemisphere, primarily white, versus the middle and lower hemisphere, more dark-skinned, where's the technology? And we know the technology that evolved in the northern hemisphere really came about by chance, that the environment, the agricultural environment there, was conducive for the development of the kinds of technologies that put the Northern Hemisphere technologically ahead of the Southern Hemisphere. This is long established. But when this is seen as being a genetic superiority of one race or another, and then we define that race based on physical characteristics like skin color, hair texture, eye shape, all nose size and shape, those kind of things, we start getting into the trouble that led to the most disastrous social policy of all time, Nazism. Okay, now, along with that, we have the birth of statistics, correlations, studies, tests, mental associations, all of this. And I want to tell you, during this is when Freud was in school. Freud was in school learning about these things. We will talk about Freud later. We see animal studies starting to come out. We see the misapplication of these ideas in terms of Nazism and whatnot. And we're introduced to a basic concept that we're going to be discussing in the class, which is the law of parsimony. Parsimony supports that the answers to our questions, given that there are a variety of answers, the most simple one is most likely what's going on, most likely the correct one. I totally believe that this is true when it comes to auto mechanics. When my car starts making a funny noise, it's probably because I have a can under a seat someplace, and it's not because my transmission's about to fall off the car. And we see that happen among tech supports for technology and whatnot. It doesn't mean that there's no chance my transmission's not ready to fall out, but most likely it's a simple solution. And we are often enraged by those mechanics that come along and say, hey, take the can out of the seat and you'll be fine. And then charge you a lot of money to do that. So but that's their job. That I don't know how to diagnose those things, so I'm thankful that they exist. Now, when it comes to human experience, though, when we have the notion of the law of parsimony, which is the simplest solution is probably the like one, we tend to focus on major effect components of a situation versus the myriad of their minor effects. Now, what I mean by that is, let's say we want to understand the relationship between someone in poverty and their ability to go to college. And we might see his money. There's obviously a correlation. What's causing this? The money is the big thing and whatnot. But then it certainly addresses a major part of the barriers between someone who lived in poverty and then going to college, but it's not the only barrier. And we have a product in our college trio which addresses a wider component of that. And that is, not only do people who have grown up in impoverished areas struggling with the financial issue of going to school, they might also be struggling with all of the factors associated that they never had a role model of going to college. They don't know how to do it. Nobody taught them how to do it. No one in their life has ever been to college. They don't know what to expect. They don't know how to study independently. Things that, had you had relatives in your household that went to college, you would have learned from them that these expectations are there. So it broadens the problem, or broadens the factors that influence the problem, and addresses them through the program specific to teaching the skills that individuals who did not have family members going to college would have got from those parents. So we see this broadening. My notion is that, particularly when you're looking at individual psychology, that it's incredibly complex. The motivations for individual behavior are usually factor in lots of variables, not only personality traits or circumstances, but sometimes even factors right in the moment. They're having a bad day, they're in pain, they're whatever, and the individual can act. in a certain way, or they're feeling really good and they can act in a certain way. So behavioral motivation is complicated. So the law of parsimony, although it contributes to a great understanding of the major causes of behavior, good and bad, is also an Achilles heel. It's also a blind spot for us about all the other factors. We have a discussion about that. So a quiz, actually. The quiz has you with a psychological example. Tell me how the law of parsimony helps and potentially hinders our understanding of that situation. So let's say you picked alcoholism. How does a simplistic, parsimonious, that's the word, parsimonious solution to substance use, how does that benefit? But how does it also create blind spots related to our understanding of substance use disorder? In the discussion, what I want you to do is to look at those 4 ways in which Darwin has influenced psychology. We'll look at the animal and comparative psychology, function for survival instead of structure, increasing diverse methodologies, and the introduction of the measurement of individual differences. Let's have a discussion about how those factors have shaped the course of psychology. Look in some of your other psychology classes, even the intro to psych class, and look some of the theories that are there, and then take that theory and describe what was the influence of these factors, or one of those factors. That you talk about emotion, you can find work being, the huge amount of work being done about infant attachment and emotional development that was done exclusively on animals that developed a deep understanding about attachment and emotional development in humans. Right there, we can see. And then we can say, well, how does that affect, how does the ability, the capacity to develop attachment and have emotional connection to people, how is that to our advantage to thrive? What are the advantages to that? And we see again that perspective from Darwin. What different methodologies do we use to explore emotions? Biochemical, medications, brain scans, tests, all of those things, and then the tests, and all that stuff. So take any theory from your intro to psych book and put it through the mill on how Darwin influenced what we now prescribe as our knowledge base on that particular area. You'll be amazed. You'll be amazed. He's all over the place. So that's it. We have the discussion on those 4 areas. We have the quiz on the advantages and disadvantages of the law of parsimony, which, by the way, exists in almost all of science. So the physicists look for that too. They look for the parsimonious solutions, and what they're finding out is the world is complex. All right. Have a great week. See you online and take care.